Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guest on this next interview. Two people have suffered injuries after a Russian drone hit a residential building in Romania near the Ukrainian border. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said that the intrusion represented, quote, another line being crossed. Meanwhile, EU foreign ministers held an informal meeting in Cyprus at a time when the bloc faces growing security challenges. The discussions come as Europe weighs new sanctions on Moscow while preparing for potential long-term confrontation with Russia. Joining us today on TVP World is Ian Boysen, Associate Professor at Civitas University. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me.
All right, so we're looking at the latest strike just a couple of hours ago where a Russian drone struck a residential building within NATO territory. Now, do you think that this exposes some kind of major vulnerabilities when it comes to air defenses in NATO's eastern flank?
Well, visibly it does, although NATO has in recent months stepped up its air patrolling and air defense activities considerably, but obviously still a lot remains to be done. We mustn't forget, and it was mentioned, Romania has a 600-kilometer long border with Ukraine, not with Russia, but with Ukraine. And as Russia, as we know, is in unrestricted manner shelling Ukraine, they simply don't care. And it's been mentioned and criticized by EU representatives. It's this utter carelessness, of course, towards civilian life in general, but also regarding these very sensitive international borders. After all, as you mentioned, it's NATO territory. And it's not the first time, as we know. Poland has been concerned by this earlier last September by many Russian drones. Russia, of course, all the time is counting on the West's relative leniency and will to de-escalate, because we cannot escalate in any military sense, but therefore all the diplomatic efforts are now being made, protests calling in Russian ambassadors. This is absolutely necessary. But of course, it shows there is a security gap, as we know, and the EU is working on this.
Right, like you mentioned, the Russian is perhaps relying on the reluctance to escalate by the West. Now, NATO and the European Commission did describe this particular incident as another dangerous escalation by Russia. At what point could repeated drone incursions or these type of incident into NATO and EU airspace trigger a stronger collective response?
Well, this is a very good question, and especially what this response could look like. Yeah. And as we, in a way, unfortunately have been sliding back, thanks to Mr. Putin, to the nuclear age. We've always been in the nuclear age, but we kind of forgot about it for the last 25 years. In the end, it's a binary situation. It's either we escalate or someone escalates or not, and it's well known the West doesn't want to do this. We actually have to look for so to say, lower scale ways of reacting without escalating ourselves. Of course, that is the economic sanctions that now again being increased with preparing the 21st sanctions packages right now. And this is the best tool the EU still has, apart from the protests. I'm not an insider, of course, to NATO internal talks, what these low-scale responses could be. Of course, there have been in the air space above the Baltic states and other NATO countries for many years. We have had all near contact or clashes between Russian and Western aircraft. It's always been avoided, and then it's been downplayed by both sides. And Russia is counting on that. We do this again. I think that's why we should really be, the West should and the EU should be really much more outspoken and not anymore, so to say, show restraint in its wording, should be very clear about this. Poland has always done that. I think all EU countries should be doing this now. But the military options I'm not aware of at this moment.
Right, and I think Europe is trying to come up with a collective response as well. There's always the calibration process ongoing, which brings us to the recent informal meeting with the EU foreign ministers in Cyprus. Can you help us understand perhaps what has been pushed forward, and are we seeing a different dynamics, a different way of approaching Russia's war against Ukraine?
Well, I think so. Of course, with the EU, it's always a slow process. I mean, it's a very encouraging sign that for the second time during this Cypriotic presidency of the EU representatives have actually met on Cyprus. At the beginning, they avoided to do this in the beginning of the year. Now they have, for the second time, met there. It's an informal format, but that's not so relevant. I think the external effect is very important. EU ministers are meeting on Cyprus under, of course, increased security conditions, but still to show towards the Middle East, which is very close to Cyprus. Cyprus is very much concerned, but especially towards Russia, that they have decided not to be scared anymore the way they used to be in the past. I mean, they have been very hesitant and passive. Now I think this has been overcome. The EU has understood it must step up. It must speak up in the international resonance space. And therefore, in this context, I think one of the most important elements of this meeting was to invite, not for the first time, representatives from non-European countries, in this case Saudi Arabia and India, to show the EU is connected, is cooperating and coordinating its efforts with other world regions that are equally concerned by, let's say, the economic ramifications of the Iran war, but also by Russia's behavior. And I think this is a very smart move, because whatever the EU now has started doing in terms of rearming and stepping up its defense capabilities on this field, the EU will for a long time to come be not unfortunately first-rank power. We have to use the tools we have, and the best the EU can do is economics and diplomacy. And by connecting, by creating a worldwide network with very different countries that share the concern about the worldwide ramifications of this great power clashes, I think this is a very smart move that can enhance the EU's possibilities to influence global affairs.
All right, speaking of using economy and diplomacy as a tool, now during this meeting, EU announced preparing another sanction package the 21st. And after the strikes in Romania, there's also been talks about sanctions by Ursula von der Leyen as well. But again, we're talking about like a 21st package of sanctions, and these sanctions keep being applied. And then we still see these incidents happening over and over again. Are they actually effective? Does it actually deter anything?
It's hard to measure and verify, and one can, of course, say now we had the 20th package not so long ago. Not the 21st package is being talking about. We can ask how effective are they. It's difficult to verify, but it's certainly not the case that there's no effect. Slowly but steadily, the sanctions, and especially again including other nations, other regions, not just the EU itself, is showing some effect. It is, of course, a limited effect. There were always loopholes and always will be loopholes, but they are becoming fewer. And other countries, let's say, if I may say so, are getting annoyed too, to use this colloquial term. And I think this is helpful to see. They see the reason of what the EU is doing and are ready to cooperate. Immediate effect, of course, is very hard to assess. Shortly speaking, it's always been said, Russia has already years ago, so to say, transformed into a war economy that can last for a long time. It's suffering heavy losses on the hands of the Ukrainian drone warriors. It's impressive how vulnerable Russia has visibly become to the Ukrainian counterattacks. But of course, the immediate effect is limited, especially of the sanctions. But as I said, it's all we can do. And the most important thing is to build these coalitions, these global coalitions, to get even countries not really interested in Russia and Ukraine, but they see the global ramification that this is simply undermining global stability, and this is what the EU, I think, is rightly addressing and offering itself as a leader. But the immediate effect, of course, that's always difficult to assess.
Right. So outside of the economic tools that you talked about, you also mentioned diplomacy as well. Recently, we see Kaja Kallas saying that Europe should not fall into Russia's negotiation trap. So what exactly is she negotiating against? And do you see the kind of two-track communication where they've just been talking about perhaps having a dialogue, but now they're also saying that it does seem like the dialogue is not going to be productive as well. Where do we go from here diplomatically?
Yeah, of course, this is one of the most interesting questions and maybe most promising ones too. On one hand, the EU has, from the outset of the war in 2022, insisted to be kind of involved by the warring parties in some future peace settlement negotiation process. On the other hand, we could from a strictly formal sense, ask what would the EU negotiate in the first place. The EU is not a party to this war, thanks God. But of course, as Kaja Kallas rightly said, we're not neutral either. And of course, Russia knows this. So the idea to have some European representative at that negotiating table when it finally will be, so to say, opened between Ukraine and Russia, on the one hand is intriguing. On the other hand, the question is what could be the function of such a European representative other than a silent supporter of the Ukrainian representative. So if we imagine this like an image, we have the Russian and an Ukrainian representative on either side of the table, and next to the Ukrainian one there's a European representative not talking, but listening, taking notes, making sure the EU gets first-hand information about it. Something like this. They would probably not talk. They would not interfere because they're not a party to the talks. Maybe Russia would then have someone else on their side. This is wholly speculative at this moment. I'd rather think, and this is also be indicated by some of the ministers who just met the other last 2 days in Cyprus, that the EU could have separate talks with Russia, not next together with Ukraine, but separate talks with Russia, not about the war and peace negotiations that the EU doesn't need in a formal sense, but in more general ways about the future European security architecture after Russia has effectively broken the one that was established in the 1990s. So this is a more, let's say, a wider view taken with a more long-term perspective. But I agree at this moment, talking about who could represent the EU on a negotiation table with Russia and Ukraine and in what way is too early. It's rather should be, from my perspective, two different formats, one between Ukraine and Russia, hopefully soon, with the EU just listening and being around, so to speak, and showing Russia that we're on the Ukrainian side, but not talking. Separately from that, EU-Russian talks about more general issues, if Russia wants that. But this is hard to say.
Right, so we'll have to see how this develops, and when it comes to NATO, whether that relative leniency will still hold after this most recent incident. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.